The plane was packed, a mix of restless passengers and the hum of engines cutting through the air. As it cruised high above the clouds, most people had settled into their seats, some chatting quietly, others glued to their screens. But in one corner of the plane, something unsettling was happening. A small group of passengers speaking in hushed tones were mocking a flag-draped coffin that had been placed in the cargo hold. The body inside was that of a fallen soldier, returning home after making the ultimate sacrifice. Their words were cruel, laughter barely disguised, their insensitivity an insult to the sacrifice that had been made. They joked about how it was just a box, a piece of cargo, and made loud remarks that betrayed their utter disregard for the soldier's service. The mood in the cabin, usually calm, began to shift. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody spoke up. Until one person, one very unexpected person, stood up. Barron Trump, who had been seated quietly a few rows away, overheard the exchange. He had been focused on his laptop, but the conversation reached him, as did the chuckles from the group of disrespectful passengers. It was hard not to hear, and harder still to ignore. Barron had grown up in the spotlight, accustomed to the attention that came with his family's name. But even he could not stand by when something as vile as this was happening. Without thinking, he stood up, his tall figure drawing the attention of the cabin. Passengers looked up, some surprised to see Barron Trump on the same flight. But it wasn't his presence they focused on. It was his demeanor. Calm but determined, he walked toward the group that had been speaking so callously. The passengers, initially unaware of who he was, continued their laughter. But when Barron approached their seats, everything changed. He looked down at them with a stern gaze, a quiet intensity in his voice as he spoke. "You know, that box you're making fun of is someone's son, brother, or father. A man who gave his life for this country," Barron said, his voice steady, but firm. "You may not know him, but his family is grieving, and this is their last chance to say goodbye." There was a brief silence before one of the passengers scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "And what are you going to do about it?" the man challenged, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Barron didn't flinch. He calmly placed his hand on the back of the chair, looking down at the man. "I'm going to ask you to show some respect, because if you can't do that, you should at least have enough decency to stay silent. What you're doing right now isn't just disrespectful, it's shameful." The other passengers around the group, who had been quietly observing, now looked at Barron in surprise. His words had weight. He wasn't simply a passenger on the plane. He was someone who knew how to use his voice when it mattered. The passengers, who had been making jokes, grew uncomfortable, realizing that Barron wasn't the kind of person to ignore something like this. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted as others began to speak up. One woman from a few rows back stood and said, "He's right. You should be ashamed of yourselves." Another passenger, a man in a military jacket, chimed in, "I served in the military, and I don't find it funny either." The group of rude passengers looked around, realizing they were now the center of attention. The laughter died down, and an awkward silence fell over the area. Barron didn't wait for their response. Instead, he returned to his seat without another word. The plane continued its journey, but the mood had shifted. The disrespect had been called out, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a collective sense of respect and understanding among the passengers. As the flight went on, a few people approached Barron, thanking him for speaking up. Some even asked if he had any advice on how they could make their own voices heard in situations like that. Barron, typically reserved, smiled politely and nodded. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about standing up for what was right. When the plane finally landed, passengers filed out, many with quiet thoughts and respectful expressions. The group that had mocked the soldier's coffin was nowhere to be seen, perhaps embarrassed, perhaps reflective. But one thing was clear. They had been silenced, not by force, but by the courage of a young man who knew when to stand up and speak out. Barron Trump may not have been the loudest voice on the plane, but in that moment, his words had carried more weight than any insult or cruel joke. He had reminded everyone on board that respect, compassion, and decency could never be compromised, even in the most unexpected of places. As the passengers disembarked, the reverberations of the incident lingered in the air. Some of the quieter passengers exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting a mixture of admiration and gratitude. Many had been too uncomfortable or uncertain to confront the rude passengers earlier, but Barron had given them a quiet sense of confidence that speaking out against disrespect was not just necessary, but powerful. Barron, however, didn't linger in the crowd. He had done what he felt was right, and now, like anyone else who had taken action based on principle, he was ready to move on. The spotlight wasn't something he sought. It was the integrity of the moment that mattered. As he walked off the plane, a few passengers gave him subtle nods of recognition, silently thanking him for making them feel proud to have been a part of the shared experience. What followed was a small but impactful ripple. News of the incident began circulating, and soon it wasn't just the passengers who were talking. Social media picked up on the story, with people praising Barron for his unexpected display of leadership and respect. News outlets, both big and small, reported on the event. But what truly moved Barron wasn't the attention he was receiving, but the response from veterans and families of fallen soldiers. Many reached out to him, expressing their gratitude for what he had done. Some wrote heartfelt letters. Others shared personal stories of their loved ones lost in battle, thanking him for acknowledging their grief and standing up for their sacrifice. It was a reminder to Barron that the impact of that one moment reached far beyond the flight. He had become part of a larger conversation about respect for the military and the importance of honoring those who gave everything for their country. Indeed, the days that followed, Barron felt a deeper sense of purpose. He had been raised in a world where public figures often had to deal with criticism and scrutiny, but this was different. This was about making a real difference, quietly, without fanfare, but with a powerful impact. It wasn't long before Barron was approached by several organizations that advocated for veterans' rights and support for military families. They asked him to help raise awareness and advocate for those who had fallen through the cracks, many of whom struggled with the transition to civilian life after serving. Barron, already passionate about these issues after witnessing the hardships faced by military families firsthand, agreed to join the cause. In time, Barron's unexpected stand on the plane became a defining moment in his journey. It was a reminder that one voice, even from an unlikely source, could shift a collective mindset. His words on that plane had sparked a dialogue that extended beyond the walls of the aircraft, touching the lives of countless people across the country. The flight, the rude passengers, and the simple act of speaking up in the face of disrespect had done more than just teach a lesson in courtesy. It had ignited a movement for honoring those who often went unnoticed. And for Barron, it was a small but significant step on a much larger path, one where he could continue to make a real difference for those who needed it most. As the weeks went by, Barron's involvement in the veteran advocacy cause began to take shape. What had started as a spontaneous one-time moment on a plane grew into a broader commitment. He began attending meetings with veterans organizations, learning more about the struggles they faced and how he could use his platform to bring attention to their issues. His family, though often in the public eye for political reasons, supported him in his efforts, though Barron kept much of his work private, focusing on the cause rather than the accolades. One of the first major steps he took was helping to organize a charity event to raise funds for veterans' health care and mental health services. Barron worked closely with other young leaders and veterans advocates, ensuring that the event wasn't just about raising money, but also about creating a space where people could share their stories and build lasting connections. The event was a resounding success, with many influential figures offering their time. But it was Barron's hands-on involvement that truly made it memorable. Barron's willingness to give his time and energy to the cause started to shift public perceptions. While he had always been in the public eye due to his family, this new role as a philanthropist and advocate gave him a more personal identity, one rooted in service and advocacy. People saw him as someone who had taken a stand when it mattered, someone who could use his position to lift others up, rather than focus solely on himself. In the months following the event, Barron kept in touch with the families he had met at the charity gala. He stayed involved in initiatives that aimed to bridge the gap between military personnel and the civilian world. He would often spend time at local community centers, meeting with veterans who had struggled to reintegrate into everyday life, offering whatever support he could. It wasn't always about big gestures. Sometimes a conversation, an afternoon, spent listening was all that was needed. Then came the moment that truly tested his resolve. He was invited to speak at a large national veterans conference, where leaders in the military and political spheres would gather to discuss the future of veterans' health care, benefits, and the challenges of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The pressure was on, and Barron knew this would be a defining moment for his involvement in the cause. The night before his speech, Barron sat alone in his hotel room, reading through the stories of veterans who had shared their experiences with him. As he read about their struggles, about soldiers who had come back to a world that didn't understand them, about families who had lost loved ones to the invisible wounds of war, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility. He wasn't just speaking to an audience. He was speaking for them, for the men and women who had given so much and who now needed support. The next day, when Barron took the stage, he wasn't the son of a famous political figure. He wasn't a celebrity or a privileged young man with an agenda. He was Barron Trump, a man who had learned firsthand about the sacrifices of those who served and who knew that this was a moment to make a difference. He began his speech not with statistics or political jargon, but with a personal story, a story of the fallen soldier whose body had been transported on that flight, the one whose sacrifice had sparked his initial involvement in this cause. He spoke about the way that soldier's sacrifice had resonated with him, how it had ignited something deep within him that he couldn't ignore. The room fell silent as Barron spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's easy to forget," he said, "that the people who protect us are real people, with real lives, real families, real dreams. But we can never forget that. Their sacrifices aren't just in the headlines. They're in the homes we live in, the freedoms we enjoy, and the everyday moments we take for granted. If we don't give back, if we don't support those who have given everything for us, then what does that say about us as a society?" The room erupted in applause. Barron had done what many had expected. He used his platform to shine a light on an important issue. But what he had also done, in that brief moment, was connect with the very people he was trying to help. His words weren't just heard, they were felt. As the event came to a close, Barron received a number of heartfelt thanks and handshakes, but it was one conversation that truly stayed with him. A young veteran just back from a tour overseas approached him. The veteran shook Barron's hand and said, "I never thought I'd see someone like you speak up for us. But today, you gave me hope. You reminded me that we're not invisible." Barron didn't know how to respond at first. The weight of those words hung in the air, and it was a stark reminder of the importance of his work. Months passed, and Barron's commitment to the veteran community only deepened. He continued to attend events, speak at conferences, and participate in grassroots campaigns, all while keeping a low profile outside of his public advocacy. Despite the media's interest in his personal life, Barron found peace in the quiet moments he spent connecting with veterans, hearing their stories, and working on initiatives that could truly make a difference in their lives. One particular project he became involved with was a rehabilitation program for veterans suffering from PTSD. Barron had seen firsthand how war could leave scars that no one could see, how mental health often became a silent battle that too many soldiers faced alone. The program aimed to provide not only therapy and medical treatment, but also job training, support groups, and a network of veterans helping each other. It was a long-term solution, focused on healing the whole person, not just addressing their immediate needs. During one of his visits to the rehabilitation center, Barron met a veteran named Michael, a former Marine who had served multiple tours overseas. Michael had been struggling with the transition to civilian life, lost in the complexities of reintegrating into a society that didn't always understand his pain. Barron spent hours talking with him, listening to his experiences, and offering support. Over time, Barron became a steady presence in Michael's journey, checking in on him, helping him navigate the system, and even bringing in experts to provide the specific care Michael needed. In their conversations, Barron learned more about the challenges veterans faced when they came home. He learned how many of them felt isolated, forgotten by the country they had fought for. Barron didn't have all the answers, but he realized that showing up, just being there, was one of the most important things he could do. He became a symbol of connection for many, a person who had used his privilege and platform not for personal gain, but to elevate those whose voices had often been drowned out. As Barron continued his work, the veteran community began to embrace him, not just as a public figure, but as an ally who truly cared about their struggles. His efforts were noticed by veteran organizations who praised him for his advocacy and the genuine heart he had shown in his efforts. Yet Barron never sought recognition for himself. He preferred to keep his work focused on the people who needed it most, even as his involvement grew. One afternoon, Barron received an invitation to speak at a special event in Washington, D.C. The event was a tribute to fallen soldiers and the families who had been left behind. Barron knew this would be a deeply emotional event, one that would touch the lives of countless individuals who had lost loved ones in service to their country. Still, he agreed to attend, understanding that the families who would gather there needed to know they were seen, heard, and appreciated. When Barron stood at the podium that day, the weight of the occasion hit him. He saw rows of faces, grieving, parents, spouses, children, all of them carrying the heavy burden of loss. He thought of the soldier on the plane, the one whose coffin had sparked his journey into the world of veterans advocacy. And in that moment, Barron knew this was the most important speech he would ever give. "I don't have the right words to ease your pain," Barron began, his voice strong but tinged with emotion. "But what I can promise you is that I will always stand with you, for you. The sacrifice your loved ones made, every soldier who gave everything for this country, is not something we should ever take lightly. Their bravery, their commitment, their selflessness, it will not be forgotten." There was a pause as Barron looked out at the audience, many of whom were wiping away tears. He continued, "It's easy to forget sometimes the cost of freedom. We live in a world where the price of liberty can feel abstract, distant. But the truth is, that price is paid every day by families like yours. And for that, we owe you a debt that can never truly be repaid. But what we can do is show respect, show love, and above all, make sure that the sacrifices of your loved ones are honored." The room was silent. Then slowly the audience began to applaud. It wasn't just a polite gesture, it was a genuine outpouring of gratitude, recognition, and a shared understanding that Barron had connected with them in a way few others ever had. That evening, as Barron walked out of the event, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road he had taken wasn't one he had planned. It had been shaped by a single moment of courage, the decision to speak up for something greater than himself. But it had led him to a place where he could make a tangible difference, where he could stand up for those who needed a voice and give them the support they deserved. As Barron's commitment to the veteran community deepened, so did his understanding of the intricate challenges that many veterans faced after returning home. He saw firsthand the obstacles in navigating the bureaucracy of veterans' benefits, the stigma around seeking mental health support, and the isolation that many veterans experienced. But Barron wasn't deterred. He became more resolute in his mission to be a bridge for these heroes, to help them find the resources, community, and respect they so richly deserved. His work began to grow, and soon he was in regular meetings with policymakers, speaking at events and using his position to advocate for much-needed reforms in how the country supported its veterans. He met with leaders in Congress to discuss improvements to healthcare and mental health services for veterans, and his voice began to carry weight in conversations that had once seemed out of reach. But despite the increasing public recognition, Barron never lost sight of the people at the heart of his work. He continued his visits to local veteran organizations and rehabilitation centers, spending time talking with veterans, hearing their personal stories, and learning how to better advocate for their needs. It was this one-on-one connection that kept him grounded, that reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. Then, one day, Barron received a letter from a veteran named Jake, who had served in Afghanistan. Jake had been struggling with PTSD and had found it difficult to integrate back into civilian life. He had heard Barron speak at an event a few months prior, and his words had resonated deeply. In the letter, Jake wrote about his struggle to find a sense of purpose after his service, about how he felt disconnected from the world around him, and how Barron's message of hope had inspired him to seek help. Jake had enrolled in the rehabilitation program Barron had helped support, and after months of therapy and training, he had been offered a job at a company that worked with veterans. The letter was a thank you, not only for the support Barron had provided, but also for showing Jake that it was okay to ask for help, that he didn't have to fight the battle alone. Reading Jake's letter, Barron was overwhelmed with emotion. He had heard many stories, met countless veterans, and been part of so many initiatives, but this one letter crystallized everything for him. It was a reminder that while systemic change was important, it was these personal stories, these individual victories that made the work so meaningful. Barron had played a small part in Jake's journey, but in that moment, he realized that sometimes the greatest impact came from simply showing up, listening, understanding, and offering a hand to those in need. The letter became a turning point for Barron. He knew that the work he was doing was making a difference, but Jake's story reminded him that the change was ongoing and that there was still so much more to be done. Barron redoubled his efforts, working with veterans organizations, advocating for more comprehensive care, and pushing for policies that better supported the mental health needs of those who had served. In his speeches and public appearances, Barron began to emphasize the importance of community. He spoke about how veterans should never feel alone, how the country needed to be a place where their sacrifices were not only acknowledged, but valued. He called for more public awareness of the mental health challenges veterans faced, and for a national effort to end the stigma around seeking help. As Barron's influence grew, so did his connection to the cause. He found himself not just advocating for change, but living and breathing it in every conversation, every project, and every interaction. He understood that the road to healing was long, and it was made up of many steps, many conversations, and many people coming together to support one another. One evening, while attending a dinner honoring military families, Barron found himself sitting next to a Gold Star mother, someone whose son had died in combat. She shared her grief with Barron, describing how difficult it had been to move forward after losing her child, but also how important it was to her that her son's sacrifice be remembered. She spoke about the lack of resources for families like hers, how sometimes it felt as though the country had moved on while they were still in mourning. Barron listened intently, his heart heavy with empathy. When she finished speaking, he didn't know what to say at first, but then he simply put his hand on hers and said, "I promise you, your son's sacrifice will never be forgotten, and I'll continue to work to make sure that no other family has to feel this way, forgotten, overlooked, or alone." The mother's eyes welled up with tears, and she gave him a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for reminding me that he mattered."